Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the Congress government in Rajasthan looking for investors. We also talk about the recent by-elections that the Aam Aadmi Party lost in Punjab. But first, we talk about Russia. It has been over 4 months since Russia started its invasion of Ukraine. Now, although in the beginning many people, including Russia, thought that this would be easy to do, that notion has turned out to be wrong. The Ukrainian forces led by President Vladimir Zelensky have stood their ground and continued to battle the Russian forces. But the war has caused a lot of casualties. The United Nations Commission on Human Rights estimates that so far over 4,600 civilians have been killed in Ukraine. But many believe that this is a very conservative estimate. For example, Ukrainian officials have said that based on the examination of mass graves using satellite images and witness testimonies, they believe that at least 22,000 people have been killed in the country. Now, to stop Russia from invading Ukraine, the Western countries, including the United States and the European Union, have been imposing sanctions on Russia. The idea has been to punish Russia economically so that it would retreat and reconsider its decisions. So far, the European Union's Council, for example, has adopted 6 such rounds of sanctions against Russia to cripple its ability to finance the war. But it turns out that these sanctions have not had the impact they were supposed to. In fact, they may have hurt the Western countries more. In this segment, we speak to Indian Express's Harish Damodaran about these sanctions. Harish, could you begin by telling us the kind of sanctions that have been imposed on Russia so far?
See, they started off by cutting off Russian banks from the SWIFT, which is basically some kind of an instant messaging service. It is through this that you are able to make international payments, cross-border payments. So they removed the Russian banks from the SWIFT system. So because of which you cannot make payments to Russia and Russia cannot make payments, especially in dollars, etc. That was the first thing. And the second thing was, it was an out-and-out sanctions. That is, you cannot trade with Russia and this kind of... Then they froze Russia's foreign exchange reserves. I think out of about $550 billion, about something like $315 billion was being held as dollars, as pounds, as euros, as gold in the jurisdiction of the Western countries, which had imposed the sanctions. So, which is why everybody expected that the Russian economy would collapse, their exports would collapse, their interest rates would rise, there would be hyperinflation. Whereas the fact is, today, if you very dispassionately, if you analyze, you can see that Russia hasn't been affected. Yes, it is true that, say, McDonald's has withdrawn, Starbucks has withdrawn, Nike has withdrawn. But beyond symbolism, they have nothing. So if you look at it, I think Russia has not been affected much.
Yeah, and you're right that this is evident in how Russia's economy is doing. Like, these sanctions were supposed to affect Russia's GDP and they were supposed to affect the ruble. But what do these indicators tell us now?
Yeah, number one, see, Russia has been reliant a lot on oil, gas, and gas exports. I think that itself is about something like almost 50% of their total exports. I think Russia's total exports is about something like $500 billion, and out of which about 50% comes from oil, gas, and even coal. So those clearly have not been impacted. Okay, Russia is producing maybe 1 million barrels per day less than, say, before the war. But then they're getting a much higher price, right? If you were getting $50 earlier, today you're getting $110 to a barrel, right? Because the prices have gone up. The prices have gone up. And since there is less oil in the world, so even if probably Russian production has come down maybe by 10%, but since prices have doubled, right? So therefore, there's been no impact on the export earnings. And the data we have, I think January to May, their current account surplus has tripled compared to last year. So their exports haven't suffered, and inflation clearly is trending downwards. Okay, and if you look at it, initially it looked like the Putin regime was entirely on the back foot. If you remember, during that period, ruble collapsed. I think it was something like 75, 76 rubles to a dollar. It fell as low as 158, 159 rubles to the dollar, which was in the first week of March. But since then, you see, today the ruble is about something like 52 or 53, which is actually the highest since, I think, May 2015. So the ruble, instead of weakening, instead of becoming rubble, it has actually strengthened, and it's become one of the most strong currencies in the world in the last few months. And similarly, the economy, I think initially they expected that it will contract by minimum 15-20%, whereas now it looks like, all estimates show that it may not be more than, say, minus 7 to 8%. So ultimately, the sanctions have not inflicted much damage to the perpetrator of the war.
And what is the reason you think that has happened? Why have these sanctions not worked the way they were supposed to?
So I think where the calculation went wrong was in assuming that Russia would be like, say, Iran or Cuba or North Korea. But Russia is a country with a lot of resources, right? If a country has enough oil, has enough gas, has enough coal, has enough wheat. We must remember that Russia is the world's biggest exporter of wheat. If you have enough fertilizers, and so a country like that is not going to collapse. It's going to find some ways of handling this. And plus, see, the Russians supply a lot of very important metals, which are very much required, including for your green technologies like palladium. Without palladium, you can't make catalytic converters for automotive emission control. Nickel. Without nickel, you can't have electric vehicle batteries. Vanadium, ferroalloys, chromium. You need all these things for stainless steel. So I think the Russians produce a lot of material which is indispensable for the world. So sanctioning a country like Russia, I think, is not the same as sanctioning North Korea, Vietnam, Iran, or say Libya. And those are all, say, one commodity or no commodity economies. Whereas Russia is not a one commodity. It's not even a gas station, as people try to say. It is much beyond that. It's a granary. And apart from oil and gas, so much of metals, minerals. It's a kind of a blessed land.
So basically a very diversified portfolio when it comes to what it exports.
Yes, definitely. So the world cannot afford to sanction Russia. Russia can afford to, be an island or maybe just trade with China. So I think in that way, it was a gross miscalculation. One is underestimating the resources which Russia has to survive. And second is underestimating their own dependence on Russia.
And you mean the dependence of European countries on Russia?
Europe, definitely. More than, say, UK and US. Europe is very much the 27-member bloc. I think they import about 45% of their gas is imported from Russia. I think something like 30% of oil and about, 52 or 53% of coal. So the reliance on Russia is very huge, So number one, as I said, is underestimating Russia's own ability to survive even in a sanction kind of a thing. The second was underestimating their own dependence on Russia. And now they are saying that after August, there will be no imports of crude oil from Russia. From August, there will be no import of coal from Russia. From December, there will be no import of oil from Russia. So you will only import gas. That's what you are saying, but how feasible it is, we don't know. The second is, of course, Russia's ability to survive because it has all the resources it can manage. It doesn't have to import anything it can manage. The third thing where I think everybody underestimated was, I think, Russia and China tying up together and Russia and India. If you see, the world's largest crude importer is China and India is number 3. We are just behind the US, and the US is more or less self-reliant kind of a thing. And today, Russia has become the number 1 supplier of the number 1 crude importing country, which is China. And Russia has become number 2 supplier of the 3rd largest crude importing country, which is India. India itself, I think last year, Russia was number 9, as far as crude supplies was concerned. Today, it has become number 2. So I think that has been the other success which Putin has sort of achieved. He has been able to diversify his markets away from Europe. Like today, China is the largest importer of Russian fossil fuels, ahead of even Germany. So if you look at it from all these angles, that is, instead of hurting Russia, you have hurt yourself more.
And so could you then tell us in what sense have these sanctions hurt the Western countries?
Well, today the Americans are paying $5 for a gallon of petrol, right? I mean, the cost of living has increased. I think most European countries are experiencing the highest inflation in 4 decades. And it's almost like a war kind of a situation, To large extent, it is self-inflicted. But at the same time, yes, what Russia has done, it is illegal, it is immoral. But whether this was the way to punishing someone and ending up hurting yourself more, this is something probably the countries have to think again. So everywhere, I think cost of living has become a very major issue. So in that way, this has been a sanction-induced inflation and probably highly avoidable. And the longer this drags on, it'll be worse. And now we are going to enter winter, right, in November. How is the West going to manage? How is Europe going to manage? I think sooner or later, they'll have to come into the negotiating table with Russia. I mean, there seems to be no other option because getting gas and oil from other sources is unviable. It is actually very artificial, right? It doesn't make sense for Hungary to get a liquefied natural gas from Qatar or from the US when you have Russia just across this thing, right? And you already have pipelines, etc. So some kind of a new strategy would be required to deal with Russian expansionism.
And do we know how Russia is expected to fare going forward, especially in the coming few months?
So I think in the coming months, you will see the Russians exporting more wheat because the US Department of Agriculture itself has projected that Russia is going to export some 40 million tons of wheat in the coming year from July. And plus, I think fertilizers. So you will see the Russians exporting a lot of fertilizers, wheat. In fact, I think the crisis probably which Russia will face in the coming months is that they might accumulate so much of credits, from exports. So they won't know what to import. How to import is going to be a big problem. So probably we might see a lot of imports into Russia happening through China. So probably China might import a lot of things which Russia is short of and maybe export that into Russia. And China also needs credits in order to be able to import from Russia. So you will see Russia, China becoming some kind of a trade bloc. And that's huge, right? I mean, if the world's two biggest producer nations come together, it's very difficult to stop this thing. And those countries will probably suck in many other countries also, Maybe to some extent India, not wholly, but definitely say Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, most of the African countries. So you may have a parallel economic bloc kind of a thing, which can cause, legitimacy problems to the West, right? I mean, in terms of the Western dominance has been based on certain principles, etc., right? So this could actually give rise to a completely new world order. So overall, it's not in the West's interest itself, I mean, let alone the rest of the world, who are paying such a high price for everything. To allow this to fester or to, aggravate it, there has to be some way to get Putin on the negotiating table. Sanctions, etc., cannot work, and cure should not worsen the disease, and definitely today we are worse off than what it was 4 months back, and maybe there could have been better ways to stop Putin than sanctions, which have probably, I don't know, maybe consolidated his position even more.
And next we talk about the Congress party. The Congress-led government in Rajasthan has been trying to get private companies to invest in the state. Their flagship program called Invest Rajasthan aims to do just that. And under this program, various institutions have been pledging investments. Now, an RTI filed by the Indian Express has revealed the list of institutions that have done so through letters of intent or MOUs signed with the state government. And turns out that two of the biggest investment pledges have been made by the Adani Group and the Mukesh Ambani chaired Reliance Industries Limited. In this segment, first Indian Express's Deep Mukherjee, who filed the RTI, explains why this is of significance.
So it is significant because if we have seen in the past few months, starting from earlier this year during the Lok Sabha session also, former Congress President Rahul Gandhi has been really vocal about investment opportunities and investments made by Adani and Ambani Group. For example, in February this year, during the debate over the motion of thanks to the president's address in Lok Sabha, Rahul Gandhi had spoken about what he called the decimation of the small and medium industry to the concentration of capital in the hands of Adani and Ambani. And he also referred to them as the double A variant.
फॉर्मल सेक्टर में मोनोपोलीज बन रही हैं. किसी भी आप सेक्टर में देखिए, और सबसे दो मोनोपोलिस्ट के बारे में थोड़ा सा बोलूंगा. उसको वो कोरोना के समय अलग अलग वेरिएंट्स आते हैं ना, डेल्टा, ओमिक्रॉन, वो डबल ए वेरिएंट है. और वो पूरा का पूरा हिंदुस्तान की जो अर्थव्यवस्था है उसके अंदर फैल रहा है.
And before that, also in December, there was a massive national rally against inflation in Jaipur by the Congress. In that rally, also, Rahul Gandhi was especially scadding towards the BJP government and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, accusing the government of giving out like airports and port coal mines to these two business groups.
हम दो हमारे दो उनके एयरपोर्ट देखो, पोर्ट देखो, कोल माइन देखो, टेलीफोन देखो, सुपरमार्केट देखो, जहां भी देखो भैया दो लोग दिखेंगे आपको, अदानी जी, अंबानी जी.
So it seems that on one hand, the Congress leadership has been criticizing both these private companies, but on the other hand, has clearly been hoping they invest in the state which is ruled by the government. When we spoke to Indian Express's Udit Mishra, who writes on the economy, he said that it makes sense that two of India's best performing private firms would be the biggest investors in a state. Not just in Rajasthan, but other states as well. And the fact that this is happening says something about the kind of state India's economy is in.
From the old era thinking where governments used to create a lot of jobs and a lot of economic activity, we are increasingly moving, post-liberalization that happened more and more. And this government has, in particular, pushed a strategy where private investments have to really channel growth, have to create jobs. And to that extent, it is not surprising that two of the biggest firms are actually at the forefront of investing, or at least pledging their investments in any state, even if it is a Congress-ruled state. So it just shows that India's future economic growth has to come from private investments only. The government's finances are not good enough or not adequate enough to really pull the economy out of its current slump that it was in post-COVID and even before COVID.
And Udit, could you talk about how investments and job creations by these big private companies are supposed to help those in the informal sector?
So, today a lot of data is going around which talks about how the MSME sector has lost its market share. And we've been seeing this story play out in the last 4 or 5 years, that more and more small players have lost out, the informal economy has lost out, and that market share has been captured by the formal industries, the formal firms. So at one level, again, this shows that more and more private firms have to invest. If they do not invest, then job creation will take a further hit. We've already had a significant crisis on the unemployment front because jobs are getting crushed in the informal sector, where the job losses are disproportionately higher when a small firm loses market share. If in such a scenario, the formal private sector doesn't step up and doesn't invest more, then it will just worsen the crisis. So at one level, it is good to see that at least some big firms are investing or taking a lead in investment in any Indian state.
And next we talk about the Aam Aadmi Party. Earlier this year, the Aam Aadmi Party had swept the Punjab Assembly elections. It was a massive victory that had come as a surprise to many because the party had won 92 out of the 117 seats. But in a recent by-election held in Sangrur, which is the pocket borough of the Chief Minister Bhagwat Mann, the party suffered defeat at the hands of a candidate who had not won a single election since 1999. In this segment, we speak to Indian Express's Manraj Grewal Sharma about this defeat and the lessons it has for the party going forward. Manraj, could you first tell us the reason why this by-election was taking place?
When these elections took place, the AAP chief ministerial faced Bhagwant Singh Mann. He was an MP from Sangrur. So after he won the assembly seat from Dhuri and took over as the chief minister, this parliamentary seat fell vacant. So which is why we had to have these by-polls.
Yeah, and the reason why these elections are making news is because the Aam Aadmi Party lost. And they lost to a party which has not been in the picture for some time. This is the Shiromani Akali Dal, Amritsar. And the candidate contesting this particular seat was its president, Simranjeet Singh Mann. So talk about him a bit before we decode the results.
Absolutely. So Simranjeet Singh Mann is a former IPS officer who had resigned in protest against the Operation Blue Star in 1984. And subsequently, he was thrown out of service and he joined politics and he set up a party called Shiromani Akali Dal Amritsar. He won his first Lok Sabha seat from Taran Taran when he was in jail. And subsequently, the last time he ever won an election was in 1999 and that was from Sangrur. So ever since, his party has been on the decline and it is one of the parties exists but never wins a seat. So it was that kind of party, and last time he was very upbeat in these elections in February. But still, the party did not gain a single seat. So out of 117 seats in Punjab, Shiromani Akali Dal Amritsar has never won a single seat since 1999. So that's a long, long time. Now, all of a sudden, you have this election after a sweep by AAP, which is completely unprecedented, a historic sweep. And you would assume that it'll be a cakewalk for the party because they barely completed 100 days in power. That took place on 23rd. That is when they completed 100 days. So which is why this is a shock. And the AAP says they did not suffer a huge drop in their vote share, just about 2%. The fact remains that someone who was nowhere in the race until recently came and trounced a candidate from a constituency which is supposed to be the pocket borough of the chief minister.
Yeah, and this is very surprising. But what are the reasons behind this? How did the Aam Aadmi Party manage to lose this seat?
See, one reason is that the voters in Sangrur, we are told that they were unhappy with the inaccessibility of the local legislators. So there are 9 assembly seats in Sangrur and all of them are held by AAP. So increasingly we heard murmurs of very disgruntled voices saying nobody listens to us, nobody gives us a hearing, the MLA has stopped taking the phone, and the local cadre was very disillusioned. So one thing we noticed during the campaign as well as on the election day was the complete absence of youngsters. Now AAP is a new party and it tends to attract a lot of youth. So I remember my colleague who was there on the polling day, she said the youth was absent. We did not see youngsters. I mean, generally they are there at the booths, etc. So I believe this was something the party workers as well as the voters had very high expectations from AAP. And the bare minimum was that it is the way they said, they are traditional parties. They are always on a high horse. They don't give a hearing to the common man. So this is a common man's party. We will always be able to get ready access. Now that we are told was missing.
Yeah, and interestingly, this is a problem that people also had with the former Chief Minister Captain Amrinder Singh, and it was one of the reasons that led to his downfall. But Manraj, the other major incident that happened after the Aam Aadmi Party came to power was the killing of singer Sidhu Moosewala. He was shot dead after his security cover was withdrawn by the AAP government. Did this also play a role in what happened in these by-polls?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that added to the popular angst against AAP. Okay, they were inaccessible, but there were people also telling us that it's just been 3 months. They're, finding their feet and so on. So there were those voices as well. But Moosewala's death, the killing on May 29th, and the way it happened after a very public withdrawal of security. So, you withdraw security, but when a person is under threat, you don't put it on the social media that now this XYZ does not have my security. That is what the government did. And I think it was ill-advised because Punjab has a lot of people who don't really need the security, but they have it. It's a status symbol. So the party perhaps was thinking along those lines that, when we advertise this fact that so many people broadcast this fact that we've removed security from so many hundred people, the common man will be happy that, these guys didn't really need security, so why so? But Moosewala's name also figured amongst them. And as unfortunately, he was shot dead very soon afterwards. So the day he was shot dead, when his body was brought to the hospital, the first thing his mother, his very grief-stricken mother, she blamed the government. The public sentiment. So here's a mother who's saying, you killed my son, naming the CM. And then there was sloganeering against the government. So that anger carried on. And it was only natural for the opposition to cash in on it. Because the opposition has all along been saying that law and order is very tenuous in Punjab. It's a border state and AAP does not have the experience. It's a bogey. And it'll suffer because it's a new government. It is not necessarily so, but his killing, it kind of beefed up that argument.
Yeah, and the other thing you write is that Moosewala was planning to support Simranjeet Singh Mann, and Mann had been using this in his campaign speeches, saying that Moosewala wanted him to win. And when we look at the AAP candidate, on the other hand, which was Gurmail Singh, he's not that popular a figure. I'm guessing that would have also gone in Mann's favor, right?
Absolutely. So on the one hand, you had all these fiery speakers. You had Simranjeet Singh Mann, an old war horse. And then on the other hand, you have Gurmail, who is retiring, who is shy, who's this decent man, but doesn't really know how to play to the gallery. And for many people thought he's like a dummy candidate. And nobody appreciates a dummy candidate. So he could not really neutralize the anger.
And Manraj, now going forward, what lessons do you think this has for the Aam Aadmi Party?
See, Aam Aadmi Party will certainly have to be more responsive to the people. It'll have to be out there. They will have to have institutionalize the process of getting feedback from the people. Because though Mann, the Chief Minister, has been time and again reiterating that all of you should be on the ground and you should be there for the people all the time. Every speech, he says this time and again. But the point is, unless you institutionalize it, you have an office where you listen to the people, everybody knows you're going to be there from XYZ to XYZ time, that becomes more methodical. It's easier to also figure out whether your MLA is doing his work or not. But simply saying and expecting the MLA to do it on his own may not be the wisest thing to do. So I'm sure they'll look at it. They have been very graceful in their defeat. They said, we will work on it. We will work doubly hard. So luckily, there has been no finger pointing or any of such things. It's been that we get the message. We will work harder.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.